I've always believed in routine. As a sixth-grade teacher, routine is what keeps the classroom running smoothly, what helps me juggle lesson plans, grading, and the occasional outburst from a restless preteen. It's what keeps my life together, period. My wife Tanya and I had our own little routine, too. Every year before the start of the new school year, I'd go in for a health checkup. I'd get the all clear, head back to the classroom, and everything would roll forward like clockwork. This year, though, the routine hit a snag. It started with a phone call. "Mr. Williams, this is Dr. Shaw's office. We need you to come in to discuss your test results." It was an unusual request. Normally, they just sent a letter saying everything was fine. When I asked if something was wrong, the nurse hesitated. "The doctor will explain everything. It's important." I could feel my heart sink a little. I'm a healthy guy, or at least I thought I was. I don't drink much, never smoked, and kept my weight under control. The only real stress in my life was the occasional tantrum from a student and the long hours grading papers. Tanya was in the kitchen when I got off the phone, her back to me as she prepared dinner. The scent of roasting chicken filled the room, but for once it didn't comfort me. "I have to go back to the doctor tomorrow," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She turned, her brow furrowing in concern. "Did they say why?" "No, just that they want to discuss my results." I shrugged, trying to play it off, but the unease was gnawing at me. "I'm sure it's nothing." Tanya smiled, coming over to wrap her arms around me. "You're healthy as a horse, Tom. Don't worry about it." Her warmth was soothing, and I leaned into her, grateful for the comfort. It was moments like these that I felt lucky to have her, to have a partner who was always there to support me. We'd been through a lot together. Her long hours at the clinic, my late nights grading, the everyday struggles of marriage, and we'd always come out stronger. Or so I believed. The next day I sat in Dr. Shaw's office, a small, sterile room that smelled faintly of antiseptic. He was a kind man, always took the time to listen, never rushed me out the door. But today, he wasn't smiling. He had a file open in front of him, his expression serious. "Tom," he began, leaning forward on his desk, "we need to talk about your test results. Is something wrong?" My mouth was dry, and I could feel my palms start to sweat. He sighed, looking down at the file as if the words there were too heavy to speak. "Your blood tests came back positive for a venereal disease." I felt the world tilt. There must be a mistake. I've been faithful to my wife. I've never. Dr. Shaw held up a hand, his expression gentle but firm. "I know this is a shock, but the tests don't lie. It's important that you and your wife both get treatment as soon as possible." My mind was spinning, 100 thoughts racing through my head, but one question stood out above the rest. How? How could this have happened? Tanya and I had always been honest with each other, or so I thought. The doctor's next words only added to the turmoil. "Until we can clear this up, the school has been notified, and you'll be placed on administrative leave. It's protocol in cases like this." Administrative leave. The words felt like a punch to the gut. My job, my reputation. It was all hanging by a thread because of this mistake. As I left the office, clutching the referral for treatment in one hand and the suspension notice in the other, I felt like I was walking in a fog. This wasn't just a disruption in my routine. It was an earthquake, shattering the foundation of everything I thought I knew. But as I drove home, one thought crystallized in my mind, cutting through the confusion and fear like a knife. I needed to talk to Tanya. I needed to know the truth. The drive home felt like a blur, the familiar streets of our small Kansas town passing by in a haze. I kept replaying the conversation with Dr. Shaw over and over in my mind, but no matter how many times I turned it around, I came to the same horrifying conclusion. One of us had cheated, and it wasn't me. When I pulled into the driveway, I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. What was I supposed to say? How do you even begin a conversation like this? But I had nowhere else to go, no one else to turn to. I had to talk to her, to confront this head on. I walked into the house, the creak of the front door announcing my arrival. The smell of dinner still lingered in the air, but now it only made me nauseous. Tanya was in the living room, curled up on the couch with a book. She looked up and smiled as I came in, but that smile faded the moment she saw my face. "Tom, what's wrong?" I couldn't answer her right away. My mouth felt dry and my heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything over the rush of blood in my ears. But I forced myself to speak, the words coming out in a rough, trembling voice. "We need to talk." She set the book aside, her brow furrowing in concern. "You're scaring me. What happened at the doctor's?" I took a deep breath, feeling like I was stepping off a cliff into a void. He said I'd tested positive for a venereal disease. Her reaction was immediate: shock, confusion, and something else I couldn't quite place. Her eyes widened, and she shook her head as if trying to make sense of it. "What? That's impossible, Tom. You've never—" "I know I haven't," I interrupted, my voice sharper than I intended. I could feel the anger bubbling up, but I forced it down. "But the tests don't lie. So that leaves only one possibility, Tanya." She stared at me, her eyes filling with tears. "You think I cheated on you?" I didn't know what to say. I wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that this was all some terrible mistake, but the evidence was staring us both in the face. "What else am I supposed to think? I've been faithful to you, Tanya. I've never even looked at another woman. And now, this." Tanya stood up, her hands trembling as she wiped away the tears that were starting to fall. "I swear, Tom, I've never been unfaithful to you. I love you. There's no one else." I wanted to believe her, God. I wanted to believe her so badly. But the doubt was there, gnawing at the edges of my mind, whispering that maybe I didn't know her as well as I thought I did. "Then how do you explain this?" I asked, holding up the test results like they were some kind of damning evidence. She looked at the paper, then back at me, her face pale. "I can't explain it, but I'll do whatever it takes to prove to you that I'm telling the truth. I'll go to the hospital right now, get tested. Anything." Her desperation was palpable, and for a moment I felt a pang of guilt. Maybe I was being too harsh, jumping to conclusions. But then again, how could I not? My life was falling apart and I needed answers. "All right," I said finally, the tension in my voice easing just a bit. "Let's go. We'll get you tested, and we'll figure this out together." She nodded, wiping her eyes again and reaching for her purse. As we left the house and got into the car, the silence between us was heavy, laden with everything unsaid. I didn't know what to believe anymore, didn't know who to trust, not even myself. But I had to see this through, had to know the truth, no matter how much it might hurt. As I drove us to the hospital, I kept glancing at her out of the corner of my eye. She looked so vulnerable, so scared, and for a moment my heart ached for her, for us, for what we were about to lose, or maybe had already lost. When we arrived, Tanya walked into the clinic with her head held high, her determination clear. She was going to prove her innocence, or at least that's what she believed. I followed her, my thoughts a tangled mess of fear, doubt, and the smallest flicker of hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, she was telling the truth. The days that followed Tanya's test results were the longest and most agonizing of my life. We barely spoke, moving around each other like ghosts in the house we once called a home. The silence was oppressive, thick with unspoken accusations and simmering resentment. The only sounds were the dull hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards beneath our feet. I found myself staying up late, unable to sleep, staring at the ceiling and wondering how we had come to this. The test results confirmed what I had feared, but had been dreading to accept. Tanya tested positive for the same STI. It was like the final nail in the coffin of our marriage, sealing in all the hurt, betrayal, and distrust. But instead of confronting it head-on, we both withdrew, retreating into our own private hells. I couldn't stay in that silence forever, though. The anger and confusion gnawed at me until I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers, needed to hear her say it, needed to understand why she did it. So, one evening, after days of tiptoeing around each other, I decided to break the silence. I found her in the kitchen, staring out the window at the darkening sky. She looked so distant, as if she was somewhere far away. I cleared my throat, trying to find the right words, but they came out jagged and raw. "We need to talk." She turned to me, her face guarded, but there was a flicker of something. Fear, maybe, or guilt. "What's there to talk about, Tom? You've already made up your mind." Her tone caught me off guard, defensive and cold. "How can you say that? We haven't talked about anything. We haven't talked about what those test results mean." Tanya crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "And what do they mean, Tom? Do you really think I'd cheat on you? After everything we've been through?" Her words stung, but I forced myself to stay calm, to keep my voice steady. "The tests don't lie, Tanya. You're positive, just like I am, and I know I didn't do anything to get it. So what else am I supposed to think?" She shook her head, a bitter smile twisting her lips. "You think this is all so black and white, don't you? You think because the tests say something, that's the end of it. But life isn't that simple, Tom. There are things you don't know, things you haven't even considered." I frowned, feeling a pit of unease forming in my stomach. "What are you talking about? What things?" She didn't answer right away, instead looking away from me, her fingers tightening around the edge of the countertop. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, almost a whisper. "I haven't been with anyone else, Tom. I swear it. But there are other ways. Things that don't make sense. Maybe. Maybe it was a mistake. Maybe the tests were wrong." Her denial, her refusal to admit the truth, only made my anger flare. "A mistake? You think both of us getting the same diagnosis is just some mistake? How can you stand there and act like you're the victim here?" Tanya's eyes flashed with anger, and for the first time in days, I saw the fight in her. "I'm not acting like anything. I'm telling you the truth, but you're so determined to paint me as the villain that you won't even consider anything else." "Like what?" I demanded, my voice rising. "What am I not considering, Tanya? Tell me, because I'm out of ideas." She looked at me with a mixture of anger and something else, something I couldn't quite place. "Maybe you should look in the mirror, Tom. Maybe this isn't about me at all. Maybe you're the one who's guilty, and you're just trying to pin it on me because it's easier than facing the truth." Her words hit me like a slap in the face, leaving me stunned and speechless. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You think I'm guilty? That I would. What the hell are you talking about?" She stepped closer, her eyes locked onto mine, her voice trembling with emotion. "You've been so wrapped up in your own anger, so sure that I'm the one who betrayed you. But have you even considered that maybe, just maybe, this isn't my fault? Maybe something else is going on here, something we don't understand." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words caught in my throat. I was furious, hurt, and confused all at once. Her denial, her attempt to turn the blame on me, was too much to handle. "Stop it, Tanya, just stop. You know what this is about. You know what you did." She shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "I didn't do anything, Tom. I love you. I've always loved you. But you're tearing us apart with your accusations, and I can't live like this." For a moment, I saw the woman I fell in love with, the woman I married. But that moment passed as quickly as it came, and all that was left was the harsh reality of our situation. "I don't know if I can believe you anymore, Tanya. I don't know what to believe." She stared at me, her expression a mix of sorrow and frustration. "If you don't trust me, then what's left for us, Tom? What do we have if not trust?" Her question hung in the air, heavy and unresolved. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that the woman standing in front of me, the woman I thought I knew better than anyone, was now a stranger. And I didn't know if we could ever find our way back to what we once were. It was becoming increasingly clear that our marriage was unraveling, threads of trust and love fraying until there was almost nothing left holding us together. The house, once filled with warmth and laughter, had become a cold, silent battleground. Tanya and I moved through it like shadows, avoiding each other, each trapped in our own priva. I didn't know what to do. Every attempt to talk, to find some common ground, ended in anger, accusations, or tearful silence. The weight of everything, her denial, the betrayal I felt deep in my bones, was crushing me. I was drowning in it, and I couldn't see a way out. One evening, after yet another argument that went nowhere, I found myself sitting alone in the living room, staring blankly at the walls. My thoughts were a mess, a jumble of anger, sadness, and an overwhelming sense of loss. I didn't recognize the life I was living anymore, and I didn't recognize the woman I had shared it with for so many years. In the middle of that confusion, a thought struck me like a bolt of lightning. The prenuptial agreement. It was something I hadn't thought about in years, a legal document we signed at the insistence of Tanya's parents. They were wealthy, protective, and wanted to make sure that their daughter was safeguarded no matter what. They even gifted us this house as a wedding present, but with the stipulation that it would remain Tanya's in the event of a divorce, unless she was unfaithful. The prenuptial agreement was clear. If one of us cheated, the other would get everything. I remembered the day we signed it. I wasn't thrilled about it, but I understood why her parents wanted it. They didn't know me well back then, and they were just looking out for their daughter. Tanya, on the other hand, seemed strangely indifferent about the whole thing. She signed it without a second thought, even though I could tell she wasn't exactly thrilled either. We both just wanted to get on with our lives together. But now, sitting there in the darkness, I couldn't help but wonder if that document was the reason Tanya was so adamant about denying everything. If she admitted to cheating, she would lose the house, the assets, everything. Maybe that was why she was holding on to her story so fiercely, even when the evidence seemed irrefutable. The thought made me feel sick. Was it possible that our marriage had come down to money and property? Had we really sunk that low? The next morning, after another night of restless sleep, I made a decision. I couldn't keep living like this, trapped in a marriage that was crumbling around me. I needed to take control of the situation, to protect myself, and to find some kind of closure. So I made an appointment with a divorce lawyer. I didn't tell Tanya where I was going. I just left the house, my stomach in knots as I drove to the lawyer's office. The prenuptial agreement was clear, and I needed to know where I stood, what my options were. I had to protect myself from further damage, both emotionally and financially. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Susan, listened carefully as I explained the situation. She didn't judge, didn't offer any platitudes. She just nodded, asked questions when necessary, and took notes. When I mentioned the prenuptial agreement, she looked up, her expression thoughtful. "You're right to be concerned about that," she said. "If infidelity can be proven, you'd be entitled to everything. The house, any shared assets, it would all be yours." "But that's the problem," I said, feeling a sense of hopelessness creeping in. "She's denying everything. Even with the test results, she's sticking to her story. How do I prove something like this?" Susan leaned back in her chair, considering my words. "Infidelity cases are always tricky, especially when one party is adamant about denying it. You'd need more evidence, texts, emails, maybe even testimony from a third party. Without that, it could become a matter of your word against hers." Her words made my stomach drop. I didn't have any of that. Just the test results, the arguments, and the gut-wrenching feeling of betrayal. It wasn't enough, not in a court of law. As I left the lawyer's office, I felt more lost than ever. The prenuptial agreement had seemed like a safeguard at the time, but now it felt like a trap, a way to keep me tied to this mess. And Tanya, what was she thinking? Was she really just trying to hold on to the house to avoid losing everything? Or was there more to it? I didn't have any answers. All I knew was that the marriage I had once cherished was slipping away, and I was powerless to stop it. By the time I reached the breaking point, the doubt had consumed me. I could no longer look at Tanya without feeling a mixture of anger, suspicion, and heartache. The woman I had once loved, trusted with everything, had become a stranger to me. Her every word, every action felt like a lie, and I couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something from me. If she wasn't guilty, why couldn't she prove it? Why did everything feel so off? I tried to piece it all together on my own. I searched through her things when she wasn't around, looking for any sign of infidelity, a suspicious receipt, a text message from an unknown number, anything that would confirm my suspicions. But there was nothing. No strange phone calls, no out-of-place emails, no secret meetings noted in her calendar. Her browser history was as clean as a whistle, filled only with work-related searches and the occasional recipe for dinner. It was as if she either truly was innocent or was an expert at covering her tracks. The more I dug, the more frustrated I became. I started to doubt myself. Had I been wrong all along? But the test results, the silence, the tension between us, they couldn't all be meaningless, could they? No matter how much I wanted to believe in her innocence, that gnawing doubt wouldn't let go. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down into an abyss of uncertainty, betrayal, and loss. My job was gone, my reputation tarnished, and the love I once had for my wife was buried under layers of mistrust and resentment. It wasn't fair. None of it was fair. And if Tanya had indeed been unfaithful, if she had destroyed our marriage for another man, then she didn't deserve to keep the house or anything else. I had lost everything, and the only thing I had left to hold on to was that prenuptial agreement. If she had betrayed me, then the law said I was entitled to everything. That thought gave me some cold comfort in the midst of my despair. So I made a decision. If I couldn't find the proof myself, I would get someone else to do it. Someone who knew how to dig deep, how to uncover the truth that people tried to hide. I hired a private detective. His name was Paul Stevens, a no-nonsense kind of guy with years of experience in cases like mine. He listened to my story without judgment, his expression neutral as I laid it all out, the tests, the arguments, the prenuptial agreement. When I finished, he nodded and told me he'd take the case. "Don't worry, Tom," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. "If there's something to find, I'll find it. It might take some time, but I'll get you the evidence you need." I wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or more anxious. Part of me still hoped that Paul wouldn't find anything, that this was all some horrible misunderstanding. But the other part, the part that was angry and hurt, wanted him to uncover the truth, no matter how ugly it might be. Days passed, then weeks, and the tension in the house grew unbearable. Tanya and I barely spoke, and when we did, it was short, clipped exchanges that only deepened the divide between us. She knew something was wrong, but she didn't press me, didn't try to bridge the gap. It was like we were just waiting, both of us, for something to break. And then, one evening, Paul called. His voice was calm, professional, but there was an edge to it that made my heart skip a beat. "Tom, I've found something. We need to meet." My hands trembled as I hung up the phone. This was it, the moment of truth. Whatever Paul had found, it would either confirm my worst fears or tear down the last wall of mistrust I had built around myself. We met in a small diner on the outskirts of town, a place where no one would recognize us, where we could talk in private. Paul arrived with a thick manila envelope which he placed on the table between us. He didn't say anything right away, just looked at me with those calm, assessing eyes. "What did you find?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. He pushed the envelope toward me. "Everything you need to know is in there." I stared at the envelope, my pulse racing. It felt like Pandora's box, a package that could unleash all the answers I'd been searching for, and all the pain I'd been trying to avoid. With a deep breath, I reached for it, my hands shaking as I opened it and pulled out the contents. Photos, emails, receipts. They all painted a picture I wasn't ready to see. There was no denying it now. Tanya had been seeing someone else, a man I didn't recognize but who was clearly more than just a friend. The evidence was irrefutable. There was no mistake, no misunderstanding. She had betrayed me. I felt a wave of emotions crash over me. Anger, hurt, sadness, and strangely a sense of relief. At least now I knew the truth. At least now I could stop wondering, stop doubting. But the truth didn't make the pain any less real. Paul watched me quietly, giving me the time I needed to process everything. When I finally looked up, my vision blurred with tears I refused to shed. He nodded slowly. "I'm sorry, Tom. I know this isn't easy." I swallowed hard, forcing myself to focus. "Thank you, Paul. You did your job and now I need to do mine." The next steps were clear. I would move forward with the divorce, armed with the evidence I needed to claim everything. The house, the assets, They would be mine, just as the prenuptial agreement promised. But as I sat there, staring at the evidence of Tanya's betrayal, I realized that no amount of property or money would ever make up for what I had lost. I had lost my wife, my marriage, my trust in the woman I once loved, and in the process, I had lost a part of myself. As I left the diner, the envelope clutched tightly in my hands. I knew that this was the end of one chapter of my life. The road ahead was uncertain, and the pain of what had happened would stay with me for a long time. But at least now I could start to heal, start to rebuild. And maybe, someday, I would find a way to trust again. The moment I handed over the envelope of evidence to Susan, my lawyer, I felt a strange mix of relief and dread. The truth was out, and there was no going back. I watched as she flipped through the contents, her expression steely and professional, though I could sense the undercurrent of sympathy beneath her calm demeanor. "You've done the right thing, Tom," she said, closing the envelope and setting it on her desk. "This evidence is more than enough to enforce the terms of the prenuptial agreement, but now we need to confront Tanya with it. The sooner, the better." Her words hit me like a hammer. It was one thing to have the evidence in hand, to know that my suspicions were correct. It was another to face Tanya with it, to watch the final collapse of the life we had built together. But I knew Susan was right. There was no point in delaying the inevitable. We needed to get this over with. That evening I sat Tanya down in the living room, the same room where we had spent so many happy years together, the same room that now felt cold and alien. I could see the tension in her eyes, the way she seemed to brace herself for whatever was coming. She knew something was wrong. She must have sensed it from the moment I walked through the door. "Tanya," I began, my voice steady but heavy with the weight of what I was about to say. "We need to talk." She frowned, her arms crossed defensively. "What is it, Tom? You've been acting strange for weeks. Just say what you need to say." I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words, but there was no easy way to do this. "I know everything, Tanya. I know about the affair. I have the evidence, photos, emails, everything. There's no point in denying it anymore." Her face went pale, and for a moment she just stared at me in stunned silence. Then suddenly the shock gave way to fury. "You had me followed. You spied on me." "I had to know the truth," I replied, my voice hardening. "You left me no choice. And now that I do know, there's only one thing left to do. We're getting a divorce." The words seemed to break something in her. She sprang up from the couch, her face contorted with rage and desperation. "No, you can't do this, Tom. You can't just throw everything away because of one mistake." "One mistake?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "This wasn't a mistake, Tanya. This was a choice you made over and over again. You betrayed me, and now you have to face the consequences." Her eyes blazed with a wild, almost unhinged light. "You think you're so righteous, so perfect, but you're nothing without me, nothing!" She lunged at me, her fists pounding against my chest, her screams echoing through the room. "You're not taking my life away from me!" I tried to back away to calm her down, but she was out of control, her anger driving her to the edge of madness. When her nails dug into my arms, I realized that this was more than just anger. This was desperation, fear, and something far darker. I tried to restrain her, to keep her from hurting me or herself, but she fought back with a ferocity that terrified me. "Tanya, stop!" I shouted, trying to hold her at arm's length. "You're going to hurt someone!" But she didn't stop. She kept screaming, hitting, scratching, her fury relentless. In that moment I realized she wasn't just trying to hurt me. She was out of control, and I was genuinely afraid for my life. In a desperate attempt to get her to calm down, I did something I never thought I would do. I slapped her, hard enough to shock her into stopping. The impact seemed to jar her out of her frenzy, and she stumbled back, holding her face in disbelief. For a moment the room was deathly quiet, the air thick with tension and the bitter taste of everything that had gone wrong between us. But then her shock turned to cold, simmering hatred. "Get out," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "Get out of my house." I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my keys and left, the door slamming behind me like the final closing of a chapter I could never reopen. I drove to a hotel, my heart still racing, my mind spinning with everything that had just happened. I had never been so afraid in my life, never felt so lost. I stayed at the hotel for days, trying to make sense of what had happened, trying to figure out what to do next. The pain of everything, the betrayal, the fight, the loss of the life I thought I had, was almost too much to bear. But there was no going back. The only thing I could do was move forward. The divorce process began soon after. Susan handled everything with cold efficiency, and I was grateful for her professionalism. We met with Tanya and her lawyer in a sterile conference room to review the terms of the prenuptial agreement. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with the weight of everything unspoken between us. Tanya sat across from me, her eyes red-rimmed but defiant. She didn't speak to me directly, only to her lawyer, but her anger was clear in every word, every glance. When Susan laid out the terms, how the house, the assets, everything would be mine, I saw the flash of fury in her eyes, the bitterness that had consumed her since that night, but she didn't fight it. She signed the papers with a trembling hand, her face a mask of cold detachment. When it was done, she stood up without a word and walked out, leaving me alone in the room with the remnants of our marriage scattered in legal documents across the table. As I sat there, the realization finally hit me. It was over. Everything was over. The life we had built together, the love we had shared, it was all gone, reduced to nothing more than a painful memory. And though I had won in the legal sense, claiming the house and the assets, I felt no sense of victory, only a deep, hollow emptiness. The divorce was finalized soon after, and I returned to the house, my house now, but it no longer felt like home. The walls were the same, the furniture untouched, but the warmth, the love that had once filled it, was gone. It was just a house, filled with memories I no longer wanted to hold on to. I realized that I had lost far more than just a marriage. I had lost a part of myself, a part that I wasn't sure I would ever find again. And as I stood in the empty house, I knew that it would take a long time, if ever, to heal from everything that had happened. But I also knew that I had to try. I had to move forward, to rebuild, to find a new path, even if that path was one I would walk alone. Time passed, and the wounds of my failed marriage began to heal, though the scars remained. Tanya left, taking whatever was left of our relationship with her, and I stayed behind in the house that was once filled with memories of our life together. Now, it was just me and the echo of what used to be, a place that had once felt like home, but now felt more like a soli. I settled into a routine, trying to rebuild my life piece by piece. The quiet of the house was both a comfort and a reminder of all that had been lost, but I was learning to live with it. The days stretched on, blending into weeks and months, and slowly, I began to find a sense of peace in the solitude. The anger that had once consumed me had dulled into a distant ache, and I was starting to see a way forward. But then, one evening, just as the sun was setting and casting long shadows across the living room, there was a knock at the door. It was an unexpected sound, one that sent a ripple of unease through me. I wasn't expecting anyone, and visitors were rare. I opened the door cautiously, and there he was, Mr. Robert Kachowski, Tanya's father. He was just as I remembered him, tall, imposing, with that air of authority that he wielded like a weapon. He had always been a reserved and strict man, someone who expected obedience and respect without question. In all the years I had known him, I had never felt comfortable around him, always feeling like I was under scrutiny, always feeling like I had to prove something. "Mr. Kachowski," I said, my voice steady but wary, "what brings you here?" Without a word, he stepped inside, brushing past me as if he owned the place. I could feel the tension radiating off him, the way his jaw was set, his eyes cold and hard. I closed the door behind him, already bracing myself for whatever was about to come. He didn't waste any time. "You've got some nerve, Tom," he began, his voice low but filled with anger. "Taking advantage of my daughter's mistake like this. You think you're so clever, don't you? Planning this whole thing just to take the house, the money, all of it." His words hit me like a slap, but I didn't back down. I had faced worse in the past months, and I wasn't about to let him intimidate me now. I didn't plan anything, I replied, keeping my voice calm. Tanya made her choices, and I made mine. I didn't want any of this, but I wasn't the one who broke our vows. Everyone makes mistakes, he snapped, his face reddening with anger. A real man forgives and moves on. You threw everything away over one mistake. One. And now you're sitting here enjoying the fruits of your little scheme. His accusation stung, but I refused to let it shake me. You're wrong, I said, meeting his gaze head-on. This wasn't about taking anything from Tanya. This was about protecting myself. Your daughter wasn't just unfaithful. She destroyed everything we built together, and I have every right to defend what's mine. The look in his eyes darkened, and I could see the anger boiling over. He stepped closer, his fists clenched, and for a moment, I thought he might actually hit me. You're nothing but a coward, Tom. You couldn't handle a real marriage, so you hid behind that prenuptial agreement. You planned this from the start, didn't you? You saw the chance to take everything, and you took it. His words were like poison, seeping into the cracks of my resolve. But I wasn't going to let him twist the truth. You're the one who insisted on the prenuptial agreement, I shot back, my own anger rising to the surface. You and your wife. You wanted to protect Tanya's assets, her inheritance, her precious house. And now you're angry because it backfired? Because I'm the one who ended up with everything? His eyes narrowed, and before I could react, he lunged at me, his fist connecting with my jaw in a sudden violent blow. The impact sent me stumbling back, pain exploding in my face. But I didn't hesitate. I struck back, hitting him square in the chest, sending him reeling. The fight was quick and brutal, years of pent-up resentment and anger boiling over in that brief, ugly moment. I grabbed him by the collar, shoving him toward the door, my voice cold and filled with finality. "Get out of my house," I hissed, the words dripping with contempt. "And don't you ever come back here again. If you do, I'll call the police. I'm done being pushed around by you." He staggered back, his face twisted with rage and disbelief. But there was something else there, too, something that looked almost like fear. He had always expected people to bend to his will, to cower under his authority. But I wasn't that man anymore, not after everything that had happened. He straightened his jacket, glaring at me with a mix of hatred and contempt. "You'll regret this, Tom," he spat, turning to leave. "You'll regret crossing me." "Maybe," I said, my voice steady as I watched him walk away. "But not as much as you'll regret underestimating me." He didn't respond, just marched to his car, slamming the door behind him. As he drove away, I could still hear his threats echoing in my ears, but they didn't bother me. Not anymore. I stood there for a moment, the cool evening air washing over me, my heart still pounding from the confrontation. But as I watched him disappear down the road, a strange sense of peace settled over me. I was pleased with myself, more than I had been in a long time. I had faced him, stood my ground, and for the first time in years I felt like I was finally free. Free from Tanya, free from her father's oppressive influence, free from the weight of a marriage that had long since turned toxic. The man who had always expected me to bow down to him, to bend under his will, was now just a fading figure in my past. I took a deep breath, the cool air filling my lungs, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I smiled. The past was behind me now, and I was ready to move forward, to start a new chapter of my life on my own terms. And as I turned back to the house, the place that was now truly mine, I knew that whatever lay ahead, I could handle it, because I had finally learned to stand up for myself, to fight for what was right, and to let go of the things that no longer served me.